Hi, I'm Ellen from the Chili Dog. Today I'm binding off a couple pairs of my Founder's Day socks, and I'd like to show you how to do the stem stitch bind off. The stem stitch bind off is a sewn bind off. So we'll be using a yarn needle instead of a knitting needle and our yarn tail to finish things off. This bind off works nicely for edges that need a little extra flexibility, like sock cuffs, as long as you don't pull your stitches too tight. For those of you familiar with embroidery, you'll quickly see how the slant of the yarn along the edge of the bound off stitches resembles the embroidered stem stitch. I'll be demonstrating two versions of the stem stitch bind off. Right-slanting, my preferred method because it's slightly easier to manipulate, and left-slanting. Make sure to watch to the end of each section because I'll show you how to neatly finish the bind off in the round. Let's get started. We'll start with the right-slanting stem stitch bind off. Before you begin binding off, you'll want to leave a yarn tail that's about 3 to 4 times the length of the edge that you'll be binding off. And then thread that yarn tail onto a yarn needle. As I bind off my stitches, I'll be working from the right to the left, and my yarn needle is going to be moving in a clockwise motion through each of the first 2 stitches on the left-hand needle. So I'll begin by going knitwise through the second stitch and pull the yarn through. And then come back purlwise through the first stitch, dropping it off the left-hand needle. Knitwise through the second stitch and pull the yarn through. And then purlwise through the first stitch and dropping it off. And you'll notice here, as I'm binding off, I'm trying to maintain an even tension, not necessarily a tight tension. You don't need to strangle your stitches or pull your yarn excessively tight as you work around. So I'm going to continue binding off until I get to my last 2 stitches. When I get to my last 2 stitches, I'll continue binding off just like I have been, and I'll go knitwise through the second stitch, purlwise through the first stitch, and drop it off and pull the yarn through. And if I were working flat back and forth in rows, I probably would bring the yarn tail knitwise through this last stitch and drop it off the needle so that my yarn would be on the wrong side of my work and I could weave it in. But I am working in the round and I'd like to minimize any potential little jog here in between the beginning and the end of the round. So instead, I am going to follow the slant of my stitches. I'm going to bring my needle knitwise through that very first stitch of the round. And then purlwise through the stitch on my needle, dropping it off. And I'll pull the yarn through. And that mostly minimizes any jog there at the join. And then I can weave in my yarn tail on the wrong side, just like normal. The left slanting stem stitch bind off is very similar to the right slanting with one extra motion. Again, you'll want to leave a yarn tail that's about 3 to 4 times the length of the edge you're binding off and thread that yarn tail onto a yarn needle. And just like before, I'll be binding off from the right to the left, and my yarn needle is going to be moving in a clockwise motion through each of the first 2 stitches. So just like before, we begin by going knitwise through the second stitch, pulling the yarn through, purlwise through the first stitch, dropping it off and pulling the yarn through. Oops. And this is where we have that one extra motion. You can see the little stem stitch that was created when we went into this previous stitch. We're going to take our yarn needle and go down underneath that stem and then pull the yarn through. Knitwise through the second stitch, purlwise through the first stitch, dropping it off and pull the yarn through. And then we want to go down underneath that stem from the top to the bottom and pull the yarn through. Knitwise through the second, purlwise through the first, dropping it off and pulling the yarn through, and then go down under that stem. Personally, I find it a little bit trickier to maintain an even tension with the left slanting rather than the right slanting. And there is that extra motion, but you can decide whether it's something you want to do or not. So I'm going to continue binding off until I get to those last two stitches, and then I'll show you how to finish things up. When I get to those last two stitches, again, I'll go knitwise through the second stitch, pull the yarn through, purlwise through the first stitch, dropping it off and pull the yarn through, down through the stem, down under the stem rather, pull the yarn through. And then again, if I was just working back and forth in rows, I'd probably just go knitwise through this last stitch and pull the yarn through, and then my yarn would be on the wrong side to finish things off. However, I'd like to minimize any gap here between the last bound off stitch and the first one since I'm working in the round. So, and I also want to maintain the slant here of my stem. So I'm going to go knitwise through the first stitch that was bound off. And that kind of also tightens up that last stitch. It's kind of loosey-goosey right now. So I'm going to go knitwise through the first bound off stitch, purlwise through my last stitch, dropping it off and pulling the yarn through. I'm going to go down under the stem, just like before. And right now, my yarn is at the front of my work, and I'd really like it on the wrong side so that it looks a little bit neater when I bind things off. So I'm just going to follow the slant of my stems, and I'm actually going to go through in the same place that this one right here goes through, just to kind of trace over the top of it. And again, the slant is maintained. Things are a little bit neater here at the join, and then I can weave in my yarn tail on the wrong side of my work. I hope you enjoyed learning how to do both the right slanting stem stitch bind off as well as the left slanting stem stitch bind off. If you did, make sure to give this video a thumbs up and share it with your knitting friends. If you'd like to support our ongoing production of tutorials or try this technique in a pattern, head over to the shop section of thechillydog.com and look for the Founder's Day Socks pattern. Until we stitch again, happy knitting!